Hi, this is Guy Burgess. For this post, I want to tell you a good bit more about the so-called things you can do actions that are at the core of this massively parallel peace-building idea that we've been trying to explain. But first, one more precedent for a massively parallel peace-building effort, and this is disaster response. And while this is a picture of the Boston Marathon bombing, a similar sort of picture would emerge in pretty much any large-scale disaster, probably pretty much in any country. People quickly understand the urgency of the problem and they want to help. They'll go to the scene and they'll look for something that needs doing that's not already being done and that they can do, or that they can, within the time frame of the disaster, learn how to do. And then they do it. And that's very much an emergent response to a community problem. Destructive, intractable conflict is similar. People also understand the urgency of the problem and they want to help. But what they're having trouble finding is the things that need doing that are not already being done that they can do or learn how to do. Because the nature of this intractable conflict problem is a lot less obvious than a simple disaster. The theory of change underlying massively parallel peace building is therefore pretty simple. We want to help and encourage people to do all of the things that need doing. And the way that we do this is that we've built, or are in the process of building, a catalog. We call it an action list of things you can do to help. That's broken into 10 categories around 10 major challenges. And within each of these challenges, there is a substantial number of subsidiary challenges and things you can do. We've got over 100 of these identified so far. And while that might seem like a pretty daunting number, the whole notion behind massively parallel is it's the kind of thing that societies with millions of people do. And when you're talking about populations at large actually undertaking hundreds of things isn't really all that daunting. And if you go back to the previous post where I talked about the environmental movement and even the peace building movement, there already are folks pursuing certainly over 100 actions related to those broad thematic areas. In terms of motivations, we're trying to appeal to first the sense of civic responsibility, and that we each have a responsibility to help maintain the society in which we live, but also appeal to this sense of enlightened self-interest, that if you understand conflict dynamics, addressing these problems is something that directly benefits you. So the first of the challenges that we've highlighted, and this is a little bit different than all the others, is figure out what's going on. Conflict assessment and mapping. If you don't understand the basic parameters of the conflict, you're likely to make a lot of decisions that turn out to be pretty counterproductive. So within this broad thematic area, for example, anyway, these are three of the things that we highlight, and there are more. One is to offer a set of materials that help people identify the core issues in a dispute. And surprisingly enough, people often get that wrong. They think the other side is motivated by issues that aren't really all that important to them. And that winds up cascading into a whole range of problems as conflict interactions continue. There's also what we call overlay issues. These are a lot of problems associated with the way in which you handle conflict that are unrelated to the core issue. Things like miscommunication, escalation dynamics, fact-finding problems, or just not knowing how to collaborate even when you want to. And another thing that you want to map at this early sort of figure out what's going on stage is areas of influence. Who can influence the system in what way? And you need to understand that before you can start to prioritize your individual efforts and where you could really make a contribution. The next broad challenge that we highlight is defending and promoting democracy. And here what we're trying to do is to block those who, for selfish reasons, want democracy to fail so they can in some way profit and dominate. So within this defending democracy category, there are a lot of other things that need doing. Certainly resisting the efforts of divide and conquer provocateurs who are actually trying to exacerbate conflict rather than resolve it. There is a need for efforts to establish and to, where it's established, protect the rule of law as a nonviolent mechanism for wisely and equitably resolving disputes. You need to also to work to delegitimize aggression, conquest, and human rights abuses. And there are a whole range of projects one could imagine in each of these categories. The third big challenge is to figure out how to encourage people to more constructively frame or think about conflicts. The idea is you want to get people to approach conflicts in ways that limit rather than intensify hostility, foster collaboration, and promote a sense of mutual respect and empathy. Within this broad category, there are a number of things that need doing. For example, expose the false promise of victory. Lots of us think that total victory is just around the corner and then we won't have to worry about the conflict anymore. The truth is these conflicts tend to go on for a long time and we need to learn how to live with them constructively. Another way of framing things more constructively is to focus on common interests, the things you have in common with your adversary, not just the differences. And then the big reframing that I alluded to in an earlier post, focus on the real enemy, which is destructive conflict dynamics, not one another. The third big challenge is to figure out how to reconcile the often unrightable wrongs of the past while envisioning a future that everyone would like for not only themselves but their children. And this requires a way of addressing past conflicts, but it also requires some sort of vision of a society in which everybody would like to live, a society that in a great many cases has never existed before. Here too, there are a whole lot of things that need doing. For example, reconciliation requires a delicate balance between the pursuit of peace, that is the end of violence, the pursuit of justice, holding people accountable, truth, having a common history of what happened, and then apology and forgiveness and mercy. There's also a need to balance cultural security and also cultural freedom. So people don't feel threatened in their culture, but do feel free to change cultural beliefs. And that's a source of a great deal of tension around the world. We also need to help people imagine a realistic future that they might want to live in that there may have been no prior history of or even precedent for. We need some creative new ideas for living in a much more diverse world with a lot more underlying tension. Still, another challenge is limiting and reversing the escalation spiral, which intensifies and polarizes conflicts in ways that make substantive problem solving impossible and violence more likely and more vicious. And again, there are a whole series of things that need to be done. For example, you need to counteract the provocateurs. These are the people who are actually, for selfish reasons, trying to drive the escalation spiral. You need to encourage people to honestly examine the downside costs of escalation. As escalation goes forward, people tend to assume that they're going to win and it's going to be a lot less expensive than it actually turns out to be. Anticipating these costs will go a long way towards getting people to be a lot more careful about intensifying conflict. And then there's a need for constructive mobilization. How do you heighten interest and awareness in an issue? How do you force people to address injustice without driving the escalation spiral in destructive ways? Yet another challenge is accurate communication. Often we think we're saying A, but the other side is hearing something totally different, Z, for example. We need to help people limit the misunderstandings due to not only poor communication skills, but deliberate disinformation and cognitive biases. And again, there are a whole range of subsidiary tasks in this broad category. One is the development of processes that encourage us to see ourselves as others see us. We often are completely unaware of what we're doing that makes others so mad. And if we could be aware of this sort of thing, often we'll say, we didn't really need to do that. That will limit a lot of tensions. We need to figure out how to overcome narrowcasting. We now live in a media environment where people focus almost exclusively on sources of information that tell them what they want to hear and reinforce existing prejudices. There's a need to scale up constructive communication. We're really good at constructive communication in small group settings to the point that they can be really conversion experiences. And we need to figure out how to do that with mass audiences. And that's a big challenge, but it's one that we ought to be able to meet. The seventh challenge involves strategies for obtaining and effectively using real facts. I mean, we need to understand when 2 plus 2 is 4 and not 5, or an awful lot of things that we try to do won't wind up having the desired results. And again, here there are a range of possibilities. One of the things that we really need is to help not only experts, but the public as a whole disentangle factual statements from values. Another thing that's really needed is joint fact-finding processes, where if you have two sides that are disagreeing about some key facts, how can you get them to work together to determine who's right or to what degree each side is right? If you can make joint fact-finding work, that's a way of diffusing an awful lot of difficult conflict problems. And everybody, I think, could benefit from a course in how to decode misleading statistics or how not to get lied to by statistics. It's real easy to present statistics in misleading ways, but not too hard to sort through that and figure out what the data really means. Yet another challenge is how to work together collaboratively. There's certainly lots of opportunities, even between groups who are in quite a serious conflict with one another, to identify areas in which they could both benefit by working together. And again, this requires a lot of subsidiary efforts. One is a series of projects that would demonstrate to people who haven't even thought about the possibility of collaboration that there are some really quite significant benefits that could result from collaborating even in the context of a difficult ongoing conflict. Another set of strategies worth exploring and developing is back-channel negotiation techniques, where unofficial negotiators can explore possibilities for working together even before the group leaders are willing to consider such a thing. And then you need the development of verification measures to help limit the double-cross problem, which undermines an awful lot of otherwise very promising opportunities to pursue a compromise agreement. The ninth challenge focuses on promoting good governance, and this includes the development of institutional structures that encourage and facilitate collaborative efforts to address social problems, but also the ability to make tough decisions in wise and equitable ways when collaboration fails. In this context, there are lots of things that need doing. Strengthening civic education, for example. People need to understand how the system works and how to use it to protect their interests. Protecting the commons, governmental institutions that protect the commons in cases where the pursuit of individual self-interest may wind up harming the interests of the larger society. Constraints are needed to protect the society and prevent this sort of thing. And then there's a real need for electoral reforms that will assure meaningful elections so people feel that A, they have a choice and that those choices matter. The 10th and final challenge is promoting the invisible hand. We need businesses that provide quality employment opportunities and affordable goods and services to all, and especially those that in some sense or another are being left behind by current economic practices and conditions. In this context, too, there are lots of things that need doing. For example, we need effective mechanisms which provide consumers with accurate information on which to base their buying decisions. We need programs that encourage businesses to produce goods and services at affordable prices for the economically disadvantaged. We need mechanisms that encourage socially responsible business practices and remove some of the incentives for exploitive business behavior. So all of these come together in a big list. And one of the key ideas behind massively parallel peace building is that solving the conflict problem is not a right answer approach. Within each of these categories, you don't pick the one that makes the difference. It's an all of the above solution, that you've really got to do all of these things and figure out how to mobilize a very broadly based effort. And that, we think, as difficult as it is the key to really addressing some very tough problems. Now, the next post will address another set of issues that are also important. This we call the second and third and fourth order problems. These are a whole series of problems that in one way or another prevent you from implementing the solutions to these first order problems, the 10 challenges that I just talked about. And again, there are a series of steps that can be taken. We'll talk about those, but broadly, they have to do with promoting and strengthening the capacity of a society to deal with intractable conflict.